folks. So I hope this fills a gap for you. And we'll just see if my slide will advance here. I may be having some difficulties on my side. Okay, there we go. So in addition to being one of the conveners of the Cochrane Rapid Review Methods group, just to share that for some of the work I'm going to present within, I may be an author or co-author on some of those, just as a declaration. And so a quick rundown of what we'll look at today. We'll talk about rapid reviews in terms of time point that they emerged in the literature and early, how they compare with other knowledge synthesis members. And I think it's helpful to maybe have that anchor or framework as to where they sit, sort of as their own species, if you will, within the larger knowledge synthesis family. What are rapid reviews, how we might look at defining them, then getting into the methods, understanding some of the shortcuts that have been taken with rapid reviews in the past, looking at process considerations when you think about the wider process of conducting a rapid review, what that looks like for a producer, and then touching on a little bit with methods that we've put together as a convener group for rapid reviews in context of COVID for Cochrane. Tamara, thanks actually for engaging folks already to give me a sense. But on your screen, you should be able to mark in here. And again, feel free to add in here. I know most of you, this is relatively new, but it would be helpful to know maybe you already have familiarity with systematic reviews, but not necessarily rapid reviews. So for the first question, maybe you're completely new altogether to knowledge synthesis. That would be A. For B, maybe you're familiar with systematic reviews, but not rapid reviews necessarily. Maybe C, you've taken a look at a couple of rapid reviews yourself, whether you're familiar with systematic reviews, or D, maybe you've produced them and have some extensive familiarity. And there might be a couple of people within that. Now you should be able to, on your screen, just take your cursor and mark within the sections there. So why don't you give that a try? And the second question is, who are you in terms of, are you come as a researcher, do you come as a policymaker, maybe you're a clinician yourself thinking about using rapid reviews, a consumer or otherwise. Now, I'm not seeing any markings here, and I'm wondering if maybe there's an aspect of extending the ability to do that maybe I've not done on my end. If that's the case, why don't you go ahead and add into the chat box, so maybe a little bit about who you are. Thanks already for sharing. That the majority of you that this is new. And I'm going to move on to the second question then, or sorry, the third question. You're a policymaker, a clinician, maybe you're a consumer, or you fit into another category. Where are you joining from? And so I've added a map here of South Africa. But maybe you're joining elsewhere in Africa or from another continent. And just to add for myself, as you're adding those into the chat box, I've had a lovely opportunity to visit in around Cape Town and the surrounding areas a couple of years ago when I was there for the Global Evidence Summit. It just a beautiful, beautiful area that is. I've not had the chance to explore a little bit further into South Africa. Perhaps I'll have a chance in the future to do so. Okay, we have folks joining from different areas and from other continents as well. Wow, this is fantastic. Thanks for letting me know. And it sounds as though, just going through the chat box, there are quite a few researchers who are joining here. This is great. Okay. And some folks know rapid reviews and systematic reviews. Oh, fantastic. Okay, super. So it might be a minute for my slide to load. I send my apologies for this. I'm not sure why I'm getting these errors. Okay, and I'll do all the technical bits in my background too. Sure. Okay, so let's start off with rapid reviews. So they emerged about 20 years ago in the literature. And this is a snapshot of some of the earlier publications that have come out relative to rapid reviews. In looking at them, is a lot of description about, folks' experience with them. Maybe they're doing it as part of a program, and an early assessment of some of the approaches that research has been undertaking. And if we were to look at one in particular that I would see as a very seminal paper in the early emergence of rapid reviews would be this one by Rebecca Gannon out of McMaster. And what her and colleagues had done was scope the literature to look at methodological articles related to rapid reviews, some rapid review examples, and really saw that there was a breadth in terms of terms that were used, time frames that were used to undertake them, and various streamlined methods as well. And so, so let's look at maybe how rapid reviews sit in the context of knowledge synthesis. And so running down sort of the left-hand side column of what you see on the screen would be your typical sort of approach for looking at developing a knowledge synthesis product. So defining your question, looking at developing the protocol, which of course is your research plan for conducting your evidence synthesis product. Then you would get into searching for literature, selecting what's relevant to your particular question or questions. For systematic review, of course, your unit of inclusion is the study itself. Then you would go to and extract information from relevant studies, conduct a risk of bias assessment or other relevant appraisal, look at synthesizing the evidence. Again, whether it's a narrative synthesis that makes the most sense, or whether with the literature you have that you can actually conduct a meta-analysis. And then you would look at applying the grade framework. So that's your interpretation of the evidence to understand what certainty you have in those results to then apply more broadly. So that would be the rundown of a systematic review. Then a living systematic review. So again, another member of this knowledge synthesis family is very much like the systematic review, except it takes a longer time frame and phase, with the idea that during that time, you would do ongoing searches of the literature to keep on top of emerging findings. And I think that that's quite relevant right now in the context of COVID, given that there's constantly new studies and new evaluations that are being done, that it's important to keep on top of the evidence to help best direct and guide decision making. Then we get into rapid reviews. And as you can see from my screen, there are a lot of stages in the rapid review process that you might consider doing something a little bit different than your systematic review. Again, with the idea that you're trying to be timely according to decision making and what that decision making time frame might be. So relative to a systematic review, you might need to look at adjusting scope. Maybe it's the number of comparisons that you need to look at. Maybe it's your list of outcomes, having to truncate that to be able to meet the time frame. You would still have a protocol, but in that protocol, you might look at adding some flexibility depending on the nature of volume of evidence. So we can get to some of those details later. In terms of your strategy, you might modify it. It may not be as comprehensive as a systematic review, but you might want to take some shortcuts there. With your selection process, again, it's thinking about, do I involve one person? If I involve two people, how do I involve them? Now, your unit of inclusion, a little bit different than a systematic review, is that the rapid review itself might include a systematic review. And so you might think of this as a knowledge translation piece. Again, it's a quick way to be able to access evidence and thinking about, what is the most relevant? How can I harness the literature that's out there, again, to inform decision-making for a user? For extraction and risk of bias appraisal, again, it's thinking about, one or two people. Maybe some of those processes, in particular extraction, are truncated. For synthesis, again, you would think of it the same as a systematic review in that you would want to see whether or not it makes sense for studies to pool. It may also not be appropriate as well, depending on how you feel about the literature. Do you feel like you've harnessed enough? So thinking about risk there. In grade, we would still recommend using grade and support the use of grade. Again, you would still likely want to be cautious in your findings, depending on, to what extent you feel like you've harnessed the majority of the literature, all of the literature. And just to add in a couple other pieces, again, just to round out this comparison, are thinking about overviews. So again, back to the systematic review process, your overview includes systematic reviews as a unit of inclusion. And then you're thinking more about harnessing information from the systematic review. Now, you may take it at face value, you may have to do reanalysis or re-inclusion of studies, depending to what extent you want to be able to look at that methodology. And grade, yeah, it might have it in the systematic review. You might want to think about whether you want to actually undertake grade assessments if the overview itself doesn't have those or the systematic reviews within them. And I want to add scoping review. And so again, follows the same process, except here you're not really evaluating the studies. It's more so about mapping them. So I hope this helps give a little bit of framework. So let's delve into a little bit more detail here. And I think just to add, you know, there can be confusion a little bit between rapid reviews and living systematic reviews. Again, just to anchor, your rapid reviews, your expedited product, may have shortcuts. I think in a lot of cases they do in terms of harnessing the literature. That's where you have the time savings. There may be also shortcuts. So if I was to think about the time frame or sort of a timeline of conducting a rapid review, you know, you would have one search that's done as part of the rapid review. For a living systematic review, you're repeatedly searching for new evidence. So it's not as much about being rapid, it's about keeping apprised or keeping your product as up to date as possible. So if you think about the time frame of a living systematic review, which would, you know, in general be longer than a rapid review, then you're looking at serial updating of the literature. And of course, in context during COVID, it might be quite often. And so, you know, it might be daily, it might be weekly. For other topics, your living systematic review might be monthly or every 2 or 3 months. It really just depends on your context. So again, just to anchor a difference between rapid and a scoping review. So rapid review would be expedited. It would still evaluate bias. It would still look at synthesizing the evidence, whereas that's not really the intent of a scoping review. So it really is just to map or catalog the literature. Could you have a rapid scoping review? Yes, I guess you could in principle. And sometimes when I'm conducting a rapid review, sometimes you end up with very little literature. And maybe what you want to do for the user is really explore some of the characteristics of the literature that you have found. And so it may look a little bit more like a rapid scoping review. However, you are really, when you're thinking about a rapid scoping review, is looking at shortcuts in the scoping review process, but it really is only about mapping, not about synthesizing the evidence. I hope that makes that clear and helps to distinguish some of these products. Okay, so let's dig into what a rapid review is a little bit more. As mentioned from the Gannon work, there's variable terminology that exists out there, and this is work that was done by Andrea Trico. Again, she had done a word cloud based on a sample. I believe it was about 100 rapid reviews that she used for that work. Again, the term rapid review is the most prevalent, but there are other terms. Might we get to convergence? I would think it's probably unlikely, and the reason why I say is because, you know, organizations have tended to come up with their own terms, and maybe have done so for very specific reasons. But I think from a Cochrane perspective, you know, the idea is that let's not focus on the label applied to the study design. Let's think more about features. And so I think how we would think about and approach that would be very much in line with that. Okay, so now let's dig into definition. So there currently is no universal definition for rapid reviews. Shannon Kelly out of the Ottawa Heart Institute in Canada did a Delphi a few years ago to look at defining features, had come up with 7. Colleagues and I have built on this work a bit more to further explore what a definition might look like and using a more recent pool of rapid reviews. And so this work is actually in press currently with the journal Clinical Epidemiology. So what we had done was look at, and just a shout out to my colleagues, Candice Hamill and Chantal Garrity for leading this work. And so they had pulled together a sample of rapid reviews in more recent times, but then also supplemented a more sort of fulsome look at the rapid review methods literature. stemming back to 1997. And so across those rapid reviews and methods papers came out with 8 themes. You can see them here, and just to briefly highlight, so how these products would have defined rapid reviews, would have used some sort of term related to the process in terms of calling it accelerated or rapid. Had used some terminology to convey that there were shortcuts, maybe abbreviated, maybe omitted. Thinking about resource efficiencies, so in context of perhaps fewer research dollars to be able to do this. Also thinking about that it being timely. Maybe there was more focus or use of a narrow topic to look at scope, sort of underpinning why they had done the rapid review, or thinking about context. Comparing or contrasting the systematic reviews, again, anchoring the rapid review process to that of a systematic review, to somewhat distinguish it and yet say it's related or draws from the same principles from. Rationale, so this refers to stakeholder rationale. So the idea is that the rapid review would have been conducted to inform policy or inform clinical practice, etc. Yet still, in many definitions, supporting that there was a rigorous or systematic, and I think in particular a transparent approach to how the rapid review was undertaken. And of course, noting that there may be some bias or limitations of rapid reviews. So this gives, I think, a sense as to how folks have defined it. So where do we move to from here? And so, our team looked at developing sort of a running definition for this. And I show it here on the screen. And so just to briefly look at it, to say that, this rapid review is a form of an auxiliary of conducting a traditional systematic review through streamlining or omitting a variety of methods to produce evidence in a resource-efficient manner. And so maybe from having just looked at that jigsaw puzzle of some of those pieces to put together a definition, some of those I think maybe are apparent now within this. And from there thought about, covering the most common themes that we had seen across papers, but with the idea that users can tailor the definition. So if they want to add in stakeholder rationale, that they certainly could, but it's at least sort of a framework to work from. Okay, so let's move on to looking at conducting rapid reviews. And I think in general, if you think about philosophically, what I've seen anecdotally arise in my sort of purview of the literature is thinking about really 2 approaches. One that looks at a one-size-fits-all approach, versus another one that's a little bit more tailored to topic. So let's unpack that. So the first, in terms of looking at a one-size-fits-all, it's thinking about, putting some frame around a definitive sort of approach in the methods that might be used across whatever products are produced by that organization or that researcher group. And so this would be, for example, defining 2 or 3 particular databases that you might use for every rapid review that you conduct, looking at a defined time range. So maybe you're always looking at the past 5 years in terms of literature. Defining, again, thinking about 1 or 2 people and exactly how they're involved in the process. So, making that a standard across products, and then looking at only English. We were to think about a tailored approach, thinking a little bit more judiciously according to the topic. So again, it's thinking if we were to anchor sort of your Cochrane systematic review to this, then if you need to expedite that process to be able to provide a product that's more timely, what makes sense for that topic? And to be able to think about what shortcuts you might apply, again, in context of the topic. So yes, you're probably looking at fewer databases and, looking at gray lit or not. Maybe there are some topics where, you really aren't because of the nature of it. Maybe it is much more focused on gray lit. You would still search a couple of databases, of course, for it to be more rigorous, but maybe more gray lit. You might look at adjusting the databases to the topic. I was involved in a rapid review we had conducted in relation to Ebola, looking at personal protective equipment when it emerged back in 2013, 2014. This was conducted for the WHO. And again, we had used a couple of mainstream databases, but we had access to some more African-based databases through our colleagues, and of course, included that to make sure we were, harnessing all the studies that we could. Maybe it's language for your context. So in Canada, it would be really important for us to harness English and French. What that looks like will depend on region and perhaps what it makes more relevant to your particular context. For year range, it would depend on the literature volume, but maybe clinical sensibility. Again, thinking the same way in terms of a systematic review, maybe it only makes sense to look at the past 8 years because that's when a particular technology emerged, for example. A more tailored approach might say, yes, we were going to look at this sort of, having dual screening, dual extraction for the majority, or you might indicate, okay, let's try for at least 60%. But in the context of doing the review, you realize, okay, we have a lot fewer studies than we thought. Let's do all. So again, trying to approximate the Cochrane systematic review as much as possible. Certainly, in a more tailored approach, you might think first again about harnessing any existing systematic reviews that have already been fully appraised, fully evaluated. Include those depending on timeline. Maybe you want to go look at the primary literature to harness more recent studies, but maybe you don't have systematic reviews at all. You want to look at RCTs, in the absence of those, down to cohort studies. So thinking about it in that process. I hope this helps to distinguish a little bit for you. Now, what might be similar in those would be you still need to adjust the number of comparisons, the number of outcomes, and removing other aspects of your literature search, like maybe there's not opportunity for author contact, and that makes sense just in terms of the timeline. Maybe you're not doing as much of an elaborate analysis relevant to a systematic review. Okay, so let's dig into a little bit more of the details, and this just provides a bit of a framework of what the general stages of what a rapid review looks like, starting at the top and moving in a clockwise fashion. For those of you who are familiar with systematic reviews, you would see a lot of these processes the same. Again, it is approximating or stemming from the systematic review process when you're conducting a rapid review. So let's look at this first step, and I think this is a really, really important piece of the rapid review conduct process, and that's your initial intake, given that a lot of these are really to feed into or inform decision making. Then you want to meet with that requester or that decision maker. So it is having a meet and greet call. During that call, then you're getting a sense of what their context is, what decision that they're wanting to look at making, what are their questions, so helping to explore that with them and unpack it a little bit, finding out, do they have a sense of the literature already, what may be out there, and also, of course, finding out their timeline of decision. Then you walk away and you do some homework. This might be a few days, this might be a week, but it's really not a long time, certainly not as long as when you're thinking about conducting a systematic review. And so here you really, for yourself, want to have a sense of scope of what literature is out there. So you want a scope, and it is very cursory. It isn't ultra detailed, but you want to get a sense of the volume and the nature of the evidence, in part because of the next two pieces. You want to be able to anticipate maybe what type of rapid review is. And this helps with feasibility. This helps to understand, okay, is there such a volume of literature out there that, doing a rapid review maybe won't do justice to this topic? Or how do we tackle this? Maybe there's systematic reviews that you can draw upon. And that helps to inform the decision with the requester. And so, yes, not only just in terms of type of product, but thinking about whether it's feasible in terms of literature, but also for yourself, if you're leading a team or participating as part of a team, who do we have to put on this? And then given that, can we then meet the timeline knowing the literature? And so all of those pieces really are interrelated. Then you come back to the requester, so either you have a follow-up, and depending on what this may be, it is likely not just one call, you will have a few others to be able to discuss this. But it is a chance to firm the questions with the requester. If the totality isn't what you can accomplish for their time frame, then look at prioritizing questions. Setting expectations, I think, is an important piece. Again, if folks are familiar with evidence synthesis, even giving them a heads up that, at the end of the day, they might not end up with a meta-analysis. and trying as much to give them a sense of we will have to see how things evolve as we work through all the stages. Of course, there's a decision to move ahead, whether that will be the case, what it looks like. As mentioned, yes, as with systematic reviews, there can be iterativeness in terms of refinement. Again, it'll be much more truncated, right? Because you're thinking about a shorter timeline and more sort of on the more, I guess, business and detailed end of it is knowing that, contracts with institutions can take time. And typically what we've done is just moved ahead and started with the work in good faith, knowing that those pieces will catch up. For protocol development, it really is the same as a systematic review in terms of approach. Ideally, you would publish or register, or at the very least make open access a record for others to be able to see, and that information is available in advance. But time may not always be conducive to it, especially depending on the timeline. But certainly you have a record of it, and when you go to make the final rapid review available, you can certainly append that as part of your product. Some differences, so some aspects may not exist altogether or be detailed, and I think a great example is subgroup analyses. You may just not have the time to think ahead in terms of subgroup variables, nor may that really be a focus of your analysis. Again, the rapid review product is there to serve decision making to a certain extent. There may be times and opportunities where it may be necessary or required that you follow up with a full systematic review. Regardless of what you do, you should still report it. If you aren't able to think about subgroup analyses or think that's really outside of the context, still indicate that in your protocol that we hadn't really given thought to subgroup analyses. As I mentioned before, there's opportunity to think about changes during the process, and I think your protocol is really an ideal place to think about that. And I brought up an example of moving stepwise through the evidence. I think it's a great place where you could identify that in the protocol. It could be the same with even your comparators or your outcomes. For that same rapid review in context of Ebola, again, we had our list of outcomes. We listed them in priority order with the idea that if we weren't able, depending on the volume of evidence, if we weren't able to tackle it all, we had thought in advance about what the most important outcomes were. And of course, we would have made it transparent if we needed to really then restrict focus. We had that framework mapped out, and then it would just be reporting according to that. Maybe some outcomes aren't possible, but they are lower down the priority list. And I think an important piece to add is how the requester would be involved in the development. I think the requester wouldn't necessarily be, you would want to make sure that the product is fit for purpose. They may not be involved in extraction and assessing the evidence, but certainly bouncing off decision making. Again, as you're encountering the nature and volume of the evidence, making sure that those decisions align with what their needs are to inform their decision making. I'm going to talk briefly about your team, and from my perspective, I really feel like skilled systematic reviewers are required. And this being that you want to be able to hit the ground running. As soon as you get a call, you may only have a week or two to sort things out and you need to hit the ground running. Much more difficult to be training people up and understanding knowledge synthesis in this context. So you want to be able to be nimble. Another aspect is also having that expertise on decisions for shortcuts. And I think having that skill, having that expertise is really important for that. I talked about personnel and how many might you have to be able to tackle a product. You might think that many hands make light work, but in context of, just speaking from my own experience, larger teams, as much as you've got more personnel power to be able to deal with that, can be a little bit more difficult to manage in terms of availability, just in terms of even just getting everyone calibrated and thinking about conflict resolution. And so smaller teams may actually work better. And so this is a piece to think about in context of your work. Another aspect of process, again, this needs to be fit for purpose, and you're doing a lot in a short period. And so I would really suggest that, from whomever is requesting this, that you have a person or maybe a very small team that you confer with throughout the process This is the snapshot of what we had done for Ebola. As you can see, the first call was June 30th. We had a final revised report that had actually gone through review, available September 30th, with really only a 7-week period to process the evidence. And so for us, having had experts, access to experts throughout this conduct was really essential. We not only got to hear what was happening on the ground in real live time, but as we had questions to help look at scope, focus scope, and be able to process through those decisions, having those folks available is really essential to be able to make sure at the end of the day we had a product that was useful for their decision making. To briefly touch on methods, and I won't go into details of these, I'll go through the next sort of number of stages in the process, and you'll have access to these slides afterwards so you can look in more detail. So again, in terms of scope, you might be limiting aspects of your PCOS, to what extent you use gray literature, use of bibliographic databases. There's empirical evidence to support that, you shouldn't just be limiting to one database. That really might be restricting it too much. But you can certainly, limit the number. So maybe it is 2 or 3 key databases. Again, if you were to use a tailored approach, you would be thoughtful as to what that looks like. You might limit to English. Again, for more traditional medicine topics, we know that at least there's one study to support that, focusing on English, you may not miss too much. But again, this may not apply to all topics. And so being thoughtful of that. How 1 or 2 people are used during selection. Maybe you're only looking at electronically available articles because you don't have time for interlibrary loans. And again, you might prioritize systematic reviews. Extraction, yes, is it 1 or 2 people? And by 2 people, do I mean it's still dual independent? Maybe you're having one person verify, have one person extract, have a second person verify their work. Maybe that's your shortcut. Maybe you're only able to verify a certain portion of your evidence or that kind of thing. You might also, as I mentioned before, limit how much extraction is, so not looking too much at depth, looking more at breadth. Again, you can think about how you use 1 or 2 people in terms of risk of bias. And just the same, empirically, we know just from looking at abstracts that having 1 reviewer can miss some. That may be okay in the context of a rapid review, but certainly not in a systematic review. Again, whether or not meta-analysis is appropriate or feasible is something you would have to think about. And again, we would support using grade, and from a small sample of reviews, rapid reviews we had looked at, very few of them actually used grade, but certainly you can use that process to flag any concerns you have about the literature. And just to say, if you want to get a sense of what rapid reviewers have done before, the majority of them have searched more than 1 database. So again, they are thinking thoughtfully about this. Searching gray literature, 70% of rapid reviews, again, this is from Andrew Trico's sample, had searched gray lit. So again, it doesn't have to be overly extensive. You could have a few key sources that you look at. But I think another piece to underscore here is that the reporting can be maybe not optimal in understanding what reviewers have done in their rapid reviews. So, how many folks contacted authors? Certainly, I have never done that in the context of my rapid review. The time just wasn't there. But a lot of rapid reviews don't say. You might infer that they didn't, but they just didn't say. And it's really important to be able to, be able to report that so folks can understand what you had used in the context of your process. In terms of limiting by date, so sure, some of them had, but it's hard to know, was it a set sort of timeline in advance, more of like a one-size-fits-all, or was that decision, informed judiciously in terms of understanding the context? Half of the reviews, rapid reviews, were limited by language. Again, the importance of this may differ by topic. Again, just to underscore the reporting, so about 40% of rapid reviews may use 2 people, but 40% they just didn't say. So I think that really leaves a gap, and it's really important to report this and stay with full text selection. Data extraction, again, a lot of rapid reviews really didn't say what they used in terms of 1 or 2 people or how 2 people were used, and the same with risk of bias appraisal. Again, we don't know whether not having done a meta-analysis was because of the nature of data, or was it because, how did producers feel about, some hesitancy in doing so and preferred a more a narrative approach. And then again, grade is not really used all that often. Just to highlight that there have been very few evaluative studies that have been done to understand the impact of these shortcuts. So it's an area that really could use more investigation. Again, as I shared, some aspects of screening of whether you use English language only. But again, it depends on topic. And I think, these shortcuts, all those also impact whether it's a more conventional style effectiveness treatment, or are you talking about more complex interventions? This is a snapshot of some of the empirical literature. If you're interested in knowing the citations for these studies, feel free to reach out. I'm happy to provide this list. This study I wanted to mention briefly because I thought that this was a really important one to think about. So, Gerald Gartlinger and colleagues had looked at surveying decision makers and guideline developers about what risk they might be interested in. And so what was interesting, they provided 3 scenarios. One was a clinical treatment, another one was a public health, and then finally a clinical prevention. And from that found that users were really only willing to accept a 10% risk of getting an incorrect answer as a trade-off for having a rapid review conducted instead of a systematic review. And I think that's really important for me. It signals the users see the importance of your gold standard systematic review. And I think as a lens that we need to keep in mind, because we as well as methodologists and systematic reviewers would also want to make sure that we were not too far off of what the quote unquote true answer or real answer might look like from a systematic review. And so I think, yeah, it's a good lens to keep in mind. I briefly want to touch on packaging, and I think is an important piece of the rapid review process. I think, journal articles, I think, serve a very academic purpose. For users, it may not be as so user-friendly. And so the support collaboration had looked at developing styles and had produced some of their work in a particular style. When I was with the Ottawa Hospital Research Institute, we really looked to that style and thought it really made a lot of sense for users. And this just gives you a snapshot of what that looked like. Again, it doesn't look like your typical journal article. It is much more, user-friendly in terms of let's give them the snapshot of what's important. And so I appreciate the details on the screen. They're a little bit small, but I think it gives you a sense of, we have our title at the top. Down the side, it gives you a sense of, well, what is this product? Some contact information about who produced this. And then really on the right-hand side is, what was the context for this decision? What was the objective of this systematic review? What were the key messages and implications? So that all of that key information is really up front. As you move through the report, then you get a more fulsome sense of your PICOs. Again, what is your key question? What is the snapshot of the evidence? And then as you dig further, then you might see a prism flow diagram. You can use some visuals here to convey some of the demographic information. You might use some of these highlight boxes again to just bring to their attention what the bottom line is. Yes, of course, you can still use tables to be able to provide information. You would still have a sense of methods. Again, the user may not be interested in those details as a forefront, but you would still want to provide that in there. Again, it's important for reporting attributions here in terms of who was involved, who assisted, and other information, again, that you can make available. And a disclaimer might be important as well, knowing again that this is not necessarily a fulsome look at the literature and therefore may or may not actually approximate what a systematic review might be. Again, I think it's about keeping it brief, and so we try to keep sort of 10 to 12 pages sort of in mind to make sure that it's not an overly lengthy document. So here's one piece that I kind of want to pause for thought and get some feedback for you. So one question that's not actually been formally addressed when thinking about rapid reviews is appropriateness. And so if I was to ask you, are there times in which a rapid review shouldn't be undertaken? What would you think, or what would you say? And I have some ideas, and I'll put them on the screen as well, but I just want to pause for thought and just see what thoughts you may have as you're thinking about this. I'm just seeing in the chat room, so as you're giving some thoughts, there were some questions about Prospero and whether or not they take rapid reviews. They do, in fact, take rapid reviews. And in fact, in the context of COVID right now, they're prioritizing any reviews, including rapid reviews that are related to COVID. But thanks for that question. I'm glad to clear that up for you. Okay, why don't I put some of my thoughts here up on the screen, and I'd be curious to see what you think. So here are some of my thoughts on having to think about rapid reviews and maybe appropriateness is, maybe there are times in particular, maybe interventions, specifically where making sure that you have the right understanding of benefits and harms, maybe that's really sensitive to missing studies. Again, we know that publication bias and other kind of reporting biases can occur. We want to make sure we're not just getting the studies that say that something is better or that's more significant than, but making sure we also get the studies to show the, well, maybe there's no difference, to make sure that that's balanced out. And number two, can we thinking about, again, where a further dig into the literature is required, maybe this is where you need to get access to information, especially from regulators, and being able to request information. Maybe that's really important in the context of your rapid review or in that topic. And given that, and given the time that that may take, maybe you would decide not to take that, or maybe to hold off, or at the very least, follow up with a systematic review. There might be topics that require extensive thought. Maybe there's really important controversy in a particular field. And I think in the context of COVID, there are pieces that are constantly emerging. Again, the decision on whether to take the rapid review really depends on context. In the context of COVID, we really need access to information. So maybe the most important piece is keeping that timely and up to date, to be able to inform decision making. Maybe producers aren't comfortable with conducting some sort of expedited analysis, especially where I have in meta-analysis and I have suspected, I think what I meant was expected, again, to manage expectations of users and perhaps even just your knowledge of the area. And again, maybe it's about complexity of topic where you really need to have important thought in sorting through the evidence and understanding the studies, thinking about generalizability, thinking about what you can attribute the results to. Okay, so there was a comment in the chat box of when the topic is connected to life or death consequences, when that 10% risk of reaching the wrong answer could effectively result in fatalities. I would agree, and thanks for sharing that, Lee. And I think that likely what you were saying, and I appreciate you sharing even before seeing my list here, that I think that maybe applies to that point A that I shared. Okay, this is great. Another one is here, when primary or new knowledge is limited, a rapid review may be of limited use. Yeah, and I think sometimes, and I've had areas where it's been sparsely evaluated, and I'm sure if this is where you're getting at, but sometimes even giving folks the state of the science to say, we may not be able to say very much. And not only that, then the rapid reviewer can also give a sense of, well, do you need to actually follow up with a systematic review right away? Maybe that's not the best use of research dollars. Maybe it really is about investing in primary studies and getting more of an evidence base before you come back to it. And so briefly, what are some of the characteristics of rapid reviews? Many address one question. That's probably not a surprise, given you're thinking about a very constricted timeline. Most questions deal with mainly effectiveness questions. There are some qualitative in DTA, but really not as prevalent in the literature. As I alluded to before, reporting is poor. I've done an evaluation relative to PRISMA, which is a reporting guideline for systematic reviews. And as you radiate out to the periphery here in this star chart, you can see you know, that there are a lot of areas where reporting just isn't there in rapid reviews. So it really is a chance and an opportunity to do better, I think, in this area. To just briefly share a little bit about us before I open things up more widely for questions. So here's a snapshot of us as a convener group. We are based collectively out of Austria, the US, and Canada, have been around for a few years. We have also developed our own sort of definition for rapid reviews in relation to interim guidance that we've made available for COVID. Again, you can see a lot of the similarities to the other definition I'd shared with you. But for us, anchoring the stakeholder piece here was really important for us, and thinking about Cochrane rapid reviews as you know, driven primarily by requesters for timely evidence for decision making. So looking at high priority or urgent or emergent context. As I mentioned, we've developed some interim guidance. We had input from a variety of Cochrane groups. We presented to them the empirical evidence, the very little that exists currently. We had them rank or rate the methods across the stage of conduct, and our recommendations are really based on those for which there was high or moderate endorsement. This gives you a snapshot of what they are. Again, a lot of these will be quite familiar to you after having gone through some of you know, what we know from empirical investigations of rapid reviews. These methods are actually, they're going to be published very soon, and I'm happy to share that link once they are out and available for you. And some quick summary points. So, you know, again, what are the questions? What will meet users' needs? What can be accomplished for the available time? Being thoughtful on approach, minimizing biases, using experienced systematic reviewers, managing expectations with the end user. Your decision to undertake may be different from topic to topic, and consider repackaging information. So if you want to reach out to me, reach out to our convener group, feel free. We'd love to engage with you. You can email us. We also have some social media profiles as well. We have 5 minutes left. It looks like, folks. Maybe I'll just pause there. Tamara, I can hand it back over to you. I don't know if folks have questions.
Great. Well, let's see. So firstly, Adrienne, amazing. Thanks for that tour de force through the rapid reviews. Really a wide look at the field, and that's incredibly helpful, and we will circulate the slides to everyone. But can I check if anyone wants to unmute and share a comment or a question, or drop a question into the chat box? And maybe while we wait for that, Adrienne, I mean, one of the things we've seen is that policymakers really like this concept of a rapid review, and I sometimes it seems to me like maybe it's not like you had a nice list of when we don't need a rapid review, and sometimes I feel like this concept of rapid is just, it speaks to the kind of policy space which is kind of very fast and rapidly moving, but in fact sometimes it takes some coaching for people to understand the need for a regular systematic review. And I don't know if there are any, you know, algorithms or ways of unpacking, you know, when do you do a systematic review? When do you do a rapid review? And I don't know if the work from Andrea Tricot informs that. And I don't even know if my question is clear, but I'm just wondering if you've also run into that issue where this rapid review is very appealing, but in fact is not always the solution.
Yeah, and you know what, I think, Tamara, that speaks very much to thinking about, should a rapid review be undertaken, or should you actually do a systematic review or wait? I think the thing that I always think about is you know, it's about that risk. So that's why I really appreciated that work, right, to see, you know, how our knowledge users, or how our knowledge users perceiving this and understanding this, appreciating that may not be generalizable. And so I think it is that discussion with the requester, and that's where I feel like that time investment is really important. And once you've had a chance to do some scoping to say, okay, well, we could undertake this, you know, but we're going to be very clear about where we think the limitations are, or whether we think that you need a systematic review. And I think there's a line between making sure you have evidence to inform decisions, but then being comfortable in what you can say on that. And
Yeah.
You know, with some experience with knowledge users and policymakers, is even once we try to share those expectations and try to hedge those expectations, still at the end of the day, they still might have a perception of what they're getting in terms of an end product. And so my advice would be is do what you can with them, but I think it's important to keep that relationship, if you can, you know, ongoing. One piece that I haven't seen too much in literature is evaluations of you know, follow-up from, you know, how a particular product was being used. And I think if you can have that follow-up with the user to understand how they used it, or where their needs may be from there, I think if you can do that, would be important.
Thanks. There's some really great questions in the chat box, Adrienne. One is about, well, this is from Punia. Puni, do you want to actually speak? And maybe you can just clarify your question. Do we have to unmute you? Because Puni was asking about the use of rapid reviews for option.
Muted. Unmuted.
Oh, I was muted. I was just checking if Puni wanted to ask her question. So these are the questions that have come up, Adrienne, about the use of rapid reviews for option appraisal in policymaking. Can you include unpublished reports? And are you developing rapid review methods for qualitative evidence syntheses?
Oh, is that just some other insights from the integration?
Hi there. Yeah, I was curious about.
Sorry, we're
whether
getting
or not
two
you
people
use
talking at the same time by the sounds of things.
So the one thing that I noticed they take part in is.
Well, now we're not getting anyone speaking. I think it might be a challenge somehow with the sound. So maybe, Adrienne, I'll just direct you to the chat box, and maybe you can respond to those that you can. Sorry, Puni, about that.
Sure, no problem at all. And Puni, feel free to add information too in the chat box. That'd be helpful. I wasn't sure what you meant by option appraisal. And Tamara, maybe you have a sense as well.
Is it policy options, implementation options? I have a feeling it's something like that, but maybe put.
Hi there, Tamara.
Videos of
I was specifically referring to whether or not you were ever requested to do a rapid review for policy options. So if the Department of Health were considering 3 or 4 policy options, whether or not you were using this methodology for this.
And so it would be, thanks for that. And so it would be policy options more or less around the same topic. Is that correct? And I think it depends. And so if I was to make that assumption, then I think it depends on what those questions then are, if they're all related to the same sort of research question. Because, you know, I think it depends on how folks are approaching the questions. Sometimes that upfront space is really important to help understand their context, and they may come with a question, may not actually be, you know, it's not prime time ready for it to be a researchable question. You have to help bridge that gap for them. So I think in terms of options, maybe it just depends on what the questions are when you're thinking about policy options. Are they all related to one question, the options, or is it a series of questions, and then how you're able to address those, and if you can in the timeline. I hope that's helpful. Maybe I'll just move on. Feel free to respond back, Puni, in the chat box. I'll go on to the next question from Patrick. Thank you for this. Does the rapid reviews consider unpublished reports? Absolutely. And so I think, again, it's thinking, you know, very much in line with a systematic review, where you want to make sure you're avoiding reporting biases like publication bias, to make sure you have a fulsome picture. And that's why I think we suggest, if you can, still search, still have a few gray literature sources. May not be as extensive of maybe what you would do in a systematic review context, but certainly having a few and using the requesters and other you know, content experts or knowledge users to help hone in on maybe what those key ones might be. I think, again, you're trying to approximate as much as possible your quote unquote Cochrane systematic review, right, as your gold standard. You just may not be able to do everything. So it's being judicious of what you can pull back from. But I think if you can do gray lit, I think that is great to be able to do that, to be able to overcome those issues. Are we developing rapid review methods for quality evidence synthesis? Thank you, Sarah, for that question. And in fact, Andrew Booth is the person that I suggest that you follow. So he's been involved with others looking at and evaluating what rapid reviews look like in context of qualitative evidence synthesis. Again, if you want some notable citations, I'm happy to do that. But I would say he and his colleagues are the best people to be able to reach out for that. Okay, that's great. Thank you for your questions. I really appreciate that. I hope that this session was helpful for you. Maybe Tamara, back to you.
Thanks, Adrienne. Absolutely great to have you on today. And such an interesting topic. And thanks to everyone who joined. There will be a recording. We'll add it to our website. And I hope we see you next month on the 10th of November, where we'll be presenting on the South African National Clinical Trial Registry. So more exciting news to come. So Adrienne, again, thanks so much for your time. We love the session, and yeah, we'll stay in touch, I know.
That sounds great. Thanks, Tamara.
Okay.
And to all, have a good day.
Okay, you too. Take care.